Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I wanted to do is do another. I've done lots of videos on Express, but never hurts to do another introductory foundational video, because I'm constantly learning more, constantly becoming wiser, so kind of re-explaining these foundational concepts. I can always just do a better job the next time around, right? So I'm going to be working with ExpressJS. This is one of many web frameworks in JavaScript. Okay, in JavaScript, to do back-end web framework work, you do need to have Node installed. So if you don't, you should head over to nodejs.org and make sure you have Node installed. Okay, and I'm going to be using the editor Visual Studio Code, so make sure that you have that as well. code.visualstudio.com. Okay. Well, I always get it wrong. Was it code? I will just Google it. Visual Studio Code. Code.visualstudio.com. That's what I did. I must have misspelled it. Okay. But, so you're going to want those two tools to follow along. Okay, so I have my Visual Studio Code opened up to a folder. So again, generally you can tell what folder your VS Code is opened up to because it'll say it like right there. So see, I have like a Foundations of Express folder that I created. You can ignore this VS Code thing. This is just because of my particular setup. And now I'm going to open up the terminal. So new terminal. And again, whenever you're in VS Code, it'll open up the terminal in the folder that you have your VS Code window open to. So since I have my VS Code open to Foundations of Express, the terminal opens up in Foundations of Express. Love that. Okie dokie. And your terminal may not look exactly like mine. If you're on Mac or Linux, you should be using a Bash or a Zush terminal. If you're on Windows, you probably have PowerShell. I recommend switching over to a Git Bash. Just download like the Git for Windows tools, and you should be able to have that. You can switch. Just click this little arrow down here, and you can kind of switch between which terminal you want. Okay. Cool. So what I want to do is create a new Node project. So again, there are many web frameworks in Node. And what a web framework does for you is it gives you the ability to create a web server. Okay, and a web server is just basically you're setting up a computer to listen on a port. Okay, so computers have a bunch of TCP IP ports. They're essentially just these little addresses on the computer where the computer can listen to requests over the internet. Okay, over the internet protocol. Okay, so highest IP port number. Okay, and this is the highest number possible. So there's these ports 1 through 65,535. Now, why is it such a random number? Because that's the highest number that fits in an 8-bit integer. Essentially, the address can be anything that fits in an 8-bit integer. So in that case, theoretically, the highest TCP port is 65,535. Doesn't mean you'll actually have that many things running on your computer at the same time, but theoretically, just so you know, so people always wonder, like, where are these numbers coming from? It's just a number. Okay, and essentially what happens is that the computer listens for TCP requests. The request should state sort of like what port the number is on, or the port the request is being sent to, and looks to see, hey, is there a program that's listening on that port? Okay. In the same way, like if you're doing front-end code, you set up a button to listen for a click, you're setting up a program to listen to a request to that port. It's just looking for that event. Okay, like a lot of programming, it's event-driven. So essentially, it's just waiting for the event to happen, and then the thing does the thing. Okay. So that's all a web server is. A web server is just literally a program that listens for requests and then responds to those requests. That response could be sending over a website. That response could be sending over JSON data that is sent to somebody else to use for their website, or used to build your own front-end website with a tool like Vue, Angular, Svelte, React, Solid.js, Riot.js. There's a lot of tools to do that with. Okay, so that's what a web server is. So again, web server is just a program that listens. It listens for requests. Those requests will go to a particular port on the computer where the program is running. Okay, when those requests comes in, it sends a response. So theoretically, it's some other computer somewhere else that's sending in these requests. Okay, so when I go to google.com, I'm sending a request to Google servers, and Google servers responds. Now you notice I never actually put like a port number when I say go to Google or I go to Facebook. The reason being is that when you're in the browser, you're using a standard protocol called HTTP. So whenever you go to an address and you write HTTP in front of it, the browser knows to send it to port 80. Okay, and generally what's going to happen is that when it gets to that computer and sends it to that request on port 80, that computer generally has like something like Apache or Nginx that then forwards it wherever it needs to go. Also referred to as a reverse proxy. Now, if it says HTTPS, HTTP secure, okay, then it's going to send it to port. Oh, I usually know this off the top of my head. It's like 413, let's see, HTTPS port number 443. There it is. Okay, 443. That's the standard port for HTTPS. So you can see like most port numbers are not used. Like again, between 1 and 65,000. There's only so many things. There's a few that do have sort of like set things, but I would say like you have a 99% chance you choose a number it's not being used by anything in particular. But 443 and 80 are sort of the standard ones. So that's why you typically don't have to write a port number when you go to a public website, because they have a web server that's listening on ports 443 and 80, because that's the default the browser is going to do when you go to HTTPS or HTTP. And then it's going to respond to those requests, send them to the right place. But we're not going to set up a port on port 80. I mean, we could, but generally we're going to set a port. Generally, you're going to set up the port that you do your own practice local development on, something like 3,000, 4,000, not 6,000. For some reason, 6,000 doesn't work. I'm still trying to remember why port 6,000 doesn't work. Like, why does port 6,000 not work? I'm sure there's a reason. Okay, finally answer. Browsers block certain ports, although they're not in the system. Okay, has some. Got it. So it's just something the browsers have for security reasons. So not 6,000. Okay, so you can don't use 443, don't use 80, don't use 6,000. Okay, and again, we haven't actually made the web server yet, so far this probably sounds like gibberish. Okay, but that's fine. It'll all make sense in a moment. So again, what we're going to do is create a web server that's going to listen on a port for requests. Now, how it responds to those requests are going to be based on functions we write. They're called, you can call them route handlers or controllers. Essentially what they do is they handle the request. So we're going to say, if this request comes in, send this response. Very much in the same way like a restaurant, okay? You have a bunch of chefs in the back, because basically the kitchen is the back end of the restaurant, and the waiters are the front end of the restaurant, creating the user experience. But the chefs, they have a cookbook. And they say, hey, when this thing is ordered, this is what you cook. That's essentially what the program is. It's just saying, hey, if this is requested, send back this. If this is requested, prepare it, send it back. Okay, that's literally the whole back-end workflow. Okay, if you can appreciate sort of that chain of command, that's it. That's back-end development in a nutshell. Okay, yes, there's databases. You can think of databases as like the freezer in the back of the kitchen, where all the ingredients are stored. Okay, so if I'm a chef, I get the order. Okay, I head back to the kitchen to go get the ingredients from the database. I prepare the plate, and then I send it back, and the waiter goes and delivers it to the client. Okay, that's essentially basically the way this all works. So if I want to create like a new Node project, so again, you can create a web server in any language. So it's not just like JavaScript with Node. You could literally create it in any language because you're not running it on the client's computer. Okay, so you don't have to worry about whether they have this particular language installed or not. You're going to run it on your own server, which could be deployed to something like a Heroku, an AWS, Google Cloud, whatever. But we're going to create a test one on our computer because we're developing it. So we want to create a new Node project. So we type in npm init, which means create a new Node project. We'll put a -y so that way we don't have to answer a bunch of questions. And this is going to create a new package.json in the folder. Okay, in this package.json folder, okay, you're gonna see, okay, here, these are things I can, this is like the details of my project. Really the things that matter here is this script section. Okay, that's going to be where we can type in little commands to make life easier. So whatever of these scripts we have, so we have test, whatever, you can create as many of these as you want, but basically what you do is you say npm run test, and it'll then run this command. Okay, so watch, it'll just, if I do that, it'll say no test specified. See, no test specified. Okay. So we can use this to specify literally any command that we want. You'll see what we'll do with it later. And then later on when we install libraries, actually we'll just do that now. So what we want to do is install npm, we're going to want to install Express Morgan. So Express is the framework. Morgan is a logger. We'll see what that does in a second. And install cores. I think that should keep us at bay for now. Let's actually also install .env. Okay, and what did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't write the word install. That would be useful. As you can tell, I literally just woke up. npm install express.env Morgan and course. Cool. Okay, and so you can see when you install something in Node, it adds it to the dependencies section, so we can see that this has been installed. Okay, and that's always important to double check that that was installed. A Node modules folder was basically added. Now here's the thing, this Node modules folder you never want to commit to Git. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're going to create a file called .gitignore. This tells Git to ignore these files, so that way when you like do a git add, a git commit, it just ignores those files. And generally the two things you're always going to want to put in here is Node modules. You never want to commit a Node modules folder to source control. And .env. We'll come back to what a .env is a little bit later. So because those two things you do not want to ever be put up on GitHub. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. We'll call this server.js. Okay. Now let me show you something fun. We could use old school Node syntax where you have to use like the word require, and I would have to since I'm currently using Node version 12.8. But you know what? I'm going to go switch over to a higher version of Node. I use what's called Node Version Manager. Highly recommend downloading it. NVM. Just look up how to install NVM on your, or Node Version Manager on your operating system. It's going to let me switch between different systems. So I'm going to say I want to use my system node, which is always up to date to the latest version. So NVM use system. Okay, so now I'm up to version 16.5. And in 16.5, actually I think it's like 14.5 or up, you can now use ES6 modules. If you've ever done like React or Angular or Vue, you might be very familiar with ES6 module syntax. That's like the whole import, export syntax versus like the require versus module.export syntax of a normal node. So in order to turn that on, you just go in here and you say type, okay, and then you say module, and that's it. And now you can use import export syntax. So that's how I'm going to do it. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import Express. So I'm going to import Express from Express. Okay, cool. So that brings in the library, and now what I want to do is I want to create a application object. So basically what happens is that the way sort of the Node server works is that when a request comes in, it passes these, it creates these two objects. So Node creates these two objects called request and response, and then it passes them into a function that has been attached to the web server that has like all the logic for the web server. Express basically has already built out that function for you and built out a lot of the really like low-hanging fruit functionality. So if you want to see what it's like to just do it from like a raw Node server, go to my blog, toots.alexmercedcoder.com. I do have a tutorial where we do that, so you can see just like all the extra work you'd have to do. But let's see here. Create But this application object represents the function that will run when your server gets requests. And basically what we're going to be able to do is register other functions with it. Because essentially the way this application works is that we create a chain of functions that plays hot potato with the request and response objects that that node creates. So what happens is that the first function runs, and the second function runs, and the third function runs, until one of these functions says, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to send a response. Once your server sends a response, that request is done. It's kind of like someone orders one plate at the restaurant, one plate goes out, okay, and that's that. And that order's done. Okay, same thing here. So we're going to sit there and describe a chain of events that will eventually lead to a response, or at least ideally lead to a response. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to say const app, we usually just call it an app, and then equals express. Express is a function that creates the application object. So it creates the express application. So now we have this app object. And essentially what's going to happen is we can register functions with this. So we can sit there and say, hey, and then it runs them in the order that we register them. So if I do app.use, that means use this function, make this a thing that receives request and response. Okay, what we do is we can write a function in here. These functions are referred to as middleware functions, because the idea is that these functions happen between well, basically it's either everything's middleware in Express. So basically middleware functions are just functions that run between the request coming in and the response going out. So in this case, again, everything is going to receive the request object and the response object. There's technically a third thing called next. So generally what the next purpose is like if you don't do a response in this function, like you don't send out a response, then you're going to want to go see if there's another function coming up. So you say next, meaning I'm done here. I'll move on to the next function. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, so app.use says when a request comes in, so hey, I have an application that's saying that when a request comes in, do this function first. And what this function will do is say console log I happened. Okay, and then we're going to go on to the next function. And then app.use. And then I do another one. Here I'm not going to bother to grab the next function because I'm not going to use it. So I just won't bother. And then here we're just going to say response. And then the response object, this object that we define right here, has a bunch of functions in it to send responses. So the simplest one is called send. This just means like send some text response. There we go. So essentially what's going to happen is that this will run first because that function's registered first. And then this function would, when it hits next, it goes to the next function in line, which would be this function. Okay, and then this sends a response, so then it just ends there. Now, that's all fine and good, but my server actually has to be listening. So then there's a function called app.listen. This is the thing that actually turns on the server and says, hey server, go listen on port 7000. Okay, not 6000 because 6000 is a problem one. Okay, so go listen on port 7000. And then what you can do is that as a second argument to app.listen, you can pass a function. Usually this is used just to have like a little message. So console.log listening on port 7000. So essentially what's going to happen is this file loads, it loads Express, it creates the application object, registers these middleware functions, and then listens. So now let me run the program. So I'll say node server.js. Okay, now if I go to localhost represents your computer. So whenever you see localhost, it means the computer that this thing is running on. Okay, so right now this browser is running on my computer, so localhost is my computer, which is good because that server is running on my computer. So localhost 7000, put slash, and see I get response. But if I go back to my terminal here, I can see it says I happened. So that means this function did run before this happened. Okay, so that's very cool. Okay, that's all fun and good. Now, what I can do is I can actually make it more specific. I can pass a first argument, okay, that basically says only use this middleware function if this is the URL. So we'll say /cheese. So now only if the URL is /cheese will this function run. Okay. So now if I refresh, it still works. Now why? The reason is because the server's still running from before, so it's running the old version of the server. So I'm gonna kill the server. I'd have to rerun it so that way the changes take into effect. That's kind of really annoying. What if I don't want to do that? There's a tool called Nodemon. So what we would do is npm install --save -dev, because we want to save it as a dev dependency, because it's not needed to run our project, but it is useful while we're developing. So we save it as a dev dependency. So --save -dev Nodemon. And what that means is just when it deploys it, like generally most deployment platforms that do automated deployments, they'll not install those dev dependencies because they know that they're not needed to run your code. They're just things that you use to help you in development. So if I go back to my package.json, I can see, look, now there's dev dependencies. So they're all installed in the same place, but like I don't have to specify it anymore. So now if I go to my package.json, I'm gonna go create some scripts. So I'm gonna create a dev script, meaning like when I want to be in development mode, and that's gonna be Nodemon server.js, and then I'm gonna have a start script for when I want to not be in development mode, and do node server.js. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna do that. So now if I want to start the server in dev mode using Nodemon, I can do npm run. Okay, npm run dev. And see, now it starts the dev server. Good. And again, since I just started it, the changes should already take place. So if I hit refresh on this, see, I get this error, cannot get, because it's saying, hey, there's no response for this request that I made. Now notice it says get. These are HTTP verbs. Okay, HTTP, every request has a verb attached to it, and then this is the URL. So a slash, it just means nothing at the end. Okay, so it's just saying, hey, there's no. It looked through my code, never did it find a response. Okay, because if we go back to my code and see, like, still I happen still ran. It still ran through that first function. So just to walk through the behavior, it ran through the first function. It logged I happened. It then went to this next function, but this next function said, hey, only run me if the URL is /cheese. So it skipped that function, and then there was nothing left. And when there's nothing left, it gives you this. Okay, cannot get slash. But if I go to /cheese, okay, I get the response again. Okay, so again, anytime you generate middleware, okay, it says /cheese. Now the one thing about using this use method is that it doesn't matter what the verb is. Okay, so that means use this function regardless of HTTP verb. Okay, now what if you want it to be used only for a specific verb? Okay, well then what you can do is you say app dot the name of the verb. So I say, hey, I want this to only happen when it's a get request, specifically to, let's say, slash. Okay, so it works the same way. And basically, I can choose not to do this. Okay, res request. So actually, I'm not sure if this first argument is optional for request response. For get, yeah, no, it should be. Okay, request response, and then we'll say response dot send. It works. Okay, so this will only work for get requests. So this function will only run for get requests. So if I hit response, back to slow, we go back here. That still doesn't quite work. I think you do need that first argument for these. Okay. Response dot send. Yeah, I think for these get ones, so like get, put, patch, etc., you do have to specify a URL. So I would have to do this, make that first argument. So that first argument is optional when you're doing the use function, but it looks like it's not optional for like when you specify a verb, get, post, put, etc. and see it works. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so basically in this case, it's got a response from this. So basically the way it ran that one is it ran this function, because this function runs no matter what. It skipped this one because the URL is not /cheese, meaning there's no cheese at the end. And then it saw this one and said, okay, this matches. Like basically the URL was just the root, so it was just the slash, and it sent the response. Okay, so that's essentially like what you're doing here. That's literally like what Express does. You're just saying, hey, run these functions. Each function is going to get basically the request comes in, the request generates this request and response object, and then it passes them to the next object. And when you hit next, all it's doing is passing the request and response object as it is at that point to the next function until it sends out a response. Okay, that's pretty much it. And again, this middleware can do anything. Okay, so that's why we have like Morgan. So I can sit there and have app.use. There's pre-made middleware by other people. So like Morgan. So actually I should have probably import Morgan. Import Morgan from Morgan. So if I use Morgan, Morgan's just a function. And essentially what Morgan's doing is that it's returning the middleware function. That's how these third-party middleware. So when I run the Morgan function, it's returning a function that's in this format. So we're passing a middleware function there, and then you have to pass in like which template you want that's in the Morgan documentation. But now Morgan, what it does, it logs, which means that every request is going to give me more details. So if I hit for hash, I go to /cheese real quick. Okay, so now look, I get these little detailed prints in my terminal. That's from Morgan, and that makes life a lot easier because I can see like, what the response was, what the request was to kind of see what my server is going through to help me debug things. So that's super useful. Okay, and then there is cores. Okay, app.use, and then we use cores, but I gotta like bring it in. Import cores from cores. Okay, and what this does is that generally, assuming that you're going to build like an API and send JSON data, okay, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with cores errors. The front end's going to be like, get an error from the browser saying, hey, your backend is not letting us call the data. The way you fix that is by setting what's called a cores header. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I do have a blog post on cores headers more in detail. I have videos on cores headers more in detail. But the bottom line is like that's the cure when you run into that problem. Okay, and then also there's sometimes variables that you would like to store and put in a safe place. For that we use the .env library. So import .env from .env. Okay, and then basically what we do there is we just call .env.config, and then that's it. That's all you need to do. What that does, it's going to look for a file called .env. If it's not there, it won't do anything. But if it is there, it's going to look for variables. So we can put variables like here, like let's say cheese. Usually what you want to do is you want to have a variable called port. That's actually technically what you really want to do. And then here's where you specify the port. So in this case, I'll specify port 7000 here. So instead of actually writing 7000 and hard coding it here, because oftentimes places that you deploy the code to will create this port variable for you. So your code needs to kind of receive it. You use process.env because these are called environmental variables. And environmental variables always get stored in this object, process.env. So it would be process.env.port. So now when I put that in there, see, it's working 7000 again. Okay, because this variable exists. And how did that become available to your code? Is because this function goes and looks for the .env file and then takes those variables and adds them to your environment. Okay, and then those are accessible through process.env in Node. And then that's how that works. That's how you would put like your sensitive API keys, database credentials, you put them in there. And then generally when you deploy it, wherever you deploy to has a place for you to do the same thing. Cool, but that's kind of like the gist. So essentially what you do is you would just create requests for whatever you need, okay? And then you would make requests, and then there's tools like Postman. Like if you want to do something other than a GET request, then you're going to want a tool like, here's like Insomnia, where you can actually like make requests. So for example, here's like a post request. If I want to make a post request to localhost 7000, which I don't have, so notice this is just a GET request to slash. So what happens if I make a post request to slash? So with Insomnia, I'll say make a post request to localhost 7000. I hit send, and see I get cannot post because I never defined a route for that. So I could do that app.post slash, okay, rec res. Rec res is just short for request response. You don't have, it doesn't, you can spell it any way you want, as long as it matches whatever is in your parameters. Okay, res.json. I'm going to send some JSON data instead. So we want to send over a JavaScript object and say hello world. Okay. Dismiss. So now if I do it, and see I get back this JSON data, hello world. Okay, so that's essentially it. You're just saying, hey, when this method is made, the browser always makes GET. So whenever you put a URL in the browser, it's always going to be a GET request. Generally, you're going to want to do other things, like, you know, generally when you want to add data to your database, you're going to use post, because it's just convention. Then you'll do that like this. Okay, and then that's it. You just sit there and you say, and then in this function, you can do whatever you want. The idea here is like, so this function can be as simple or as complicated as you want. So you could say, hey, I make this request, and then in there you have all this code that says, okay, go to this database, grab this data, format it this way, and then send it back as JSON. You know, you can be creative as you want. Or maybe in the function you make it a call to another API, get the data, and then send it back to your front end. That's what's referred to as using it as a proxy server. But yeah, that's essentially what you can do with Express. And this same kind of patterns you can do with Koa, which is another popular web framework on Node, and Fastify, which is another popular framework on Node. I do have a tutorial where actually you can build a server in Fastify, Koa, and Express back to back. That's at toots.alexmerced.com. Again, that's toots.alexmercedcoder.com. And that's actually this tutorial right here, Basics of Building a CRUD API with Node.js. That'll walk you through building with all three frameworks now that you kind of know what you know. Another really good Express template, let me find it. Well, that's another Fastify tutorial, not a bad one. Where is the Express one I'm looking for? New, I think I might have passed it already. I think that was it right there. Yep, here we go. Intro to Express templating with APIs. This will show you how to actually, instead of sending over like JSON data, this will show you how to send over like the actual HTML files to the front end. Okay, so yeah, those are just some other cool things to try out if you found this interesting. But my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy, and hopefully this gave you a better idea of how to use Express.